Third,
Sorry.
this is our third seminar of the year. I'm Judi, Director of Center for Drug Safety and Effectiveness with Dr. Caleb Alexander. So welcome to the students and faculty. I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Judi and Cashin, our distinguished guest this month. As you know, we like to invite speakers from academia, from government, and from the biopharmaceutical industry, as they all have different insights into our field of pharmacoepidemiology. Dr. Cashin has a very rich career as an executive in biopharma. She's the new Chief Medical Officer at Novotech, which is a contract research organization. The prior positions have included as Chief Medical Officer at Eagle Pharmaceuticals and at AO Bio. She was Chief Scientific Officer at Syneos and at INC Research. She was a Vice President at Quinn Piles and was a Vice President at GSK for a number of years. She's an infectious disease doctor, having done her fellowship in infectious diseases and hematology oncology at University of North Carolina. She was a resident in internal medicine at University of Chicago, which is how I know her, back when we were interns together. Her medical degree is from Rush Medical College and doing some undergraduate at Duke. So glad you could be with us today. You're busy in your new job, and we're delighted to learn from you today, Judi.
Thank you, Judi. I'm so pleased to be with you all. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I have been, as Judi mentioned, I've taken this new role and have been traveling a lot. But I am really excited to talk to you a little bit about post-marketing safety and pharmacovigilance from an industry and regulatory perspective. So hopefully it's a little bit different than the sort of academic approach many of you have or are experiencing in this part of your career and education. And I hope you find it interesting. So to get started, hold on. There. What is pharmacovigilance? Well, broadly, it's the science and activities that relate to the detection, assessment, and understanding and prevention of adverse effects or other problems related to a medicine or a therapeutic intervention. So pharmacovigilance, particularly in the post-marketing setting, so that's after all the clinical trials, and in the US, when the FDA has approved a therapy for market authorization. In this setting, pharmacovigilance is the job not only of the regulators, but also the manufacturers or the sponsors or the drug company, and also the clinicians. So that in the real world, the people who are prescribing and using these therapeutic interventions. So what is the purpose of pharmacovigilance? To evaluate the safety of the drug or biologic product, but also to advance public health by detecting and analyzing safety signals from all available data sources using evidence-based methods. So we'll talk about these data sources later on in the talk. The regulators recommend appropriate action based on these data that might include labeling changes or risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, or even things like pulling a therapy off the market. And then finally, this safety data isn't useful in the real world unless that information is communicated to the public and to the clinicians. So that's another role of the FDA in this situation. So let's talk about safety in the life cycle of products that are regulated by the FDA. So here I'm mainly talking about prescription products. So even before any human is dosed with a therapy, there's a whole body of preclinical data that are generated for many purposes, but eventually to explore the safety and biologic activity. So this is done in vitro models, in animal models that sort of help the manufacturer understand what they should be looking out for in terms of safety and efficacy and dosage as they approach human trials. In phase 1, the main purpose is to really look at safety. So many of you will have experience with clinical trials, and just remember in phase 1, even though the subjects who sign up or volunteer for those trials, particularly patients, might be looking for efficacy, the real purpose is safety. And then in phase 2 and 3, we're looking for safety and efficacy that justify continued development and application for market authorization. What we're going to talk about mainly today is post-marketing safety surveillance. So that's looking at safety concerns after market authorization, where the sort of denominator, if you like, is much bigger. So across these phases of development, both the agency and the manufacturer are looking at safety concerns and adjusting their risk-benefit analysis based on those emerging data, and if appropriate, creating risk mitigation plans. So I thought I'd just review the phases of medicine development pre-market authorization. We talked about a little bit about the preclinical evaluation and identification of dose and safety parameters for clinical monitoring. An example of this is, say, in your animal models, you notice some liver enzyme elevation. That would prompt you to more carefully monitor liver enzymes as you go into phase 1. It's important to note that sometimes the preclinical data can predict and translate to human experience, and sometimes not. So that's why in phase 1, we tend to be very conservative about starting dose and dose escalation, et cetera. So in phase 1, we're looking to estimate the tolerability and the dose range that is going to be expected to be used in further trials that are looking at efficacy. Often these phase 1 trials are in healthy volunteers, but sometimes we do these studies in patients when the intervention presents an inappropriate risk. So you can think of conventional cytotoxic chemotherapy is not something anybody would feel comfortable from a medical ethics point of view putting in a healthy volunteer. Sometimes we do phase 1 studies in patients when it's not feasible to study like a gene therapy for a rare disease. It's not an appropriate model to give that to healthy volunteers. Phase 2, we're looking at dose range in patients with the indication of interest. And phase 3 are your large randomized controlled trials that are looking for therapeutic effect. And this is the real cornerstone of regulatory approval. But as you can see, throughout this preclinical phase, we're generating safety data, and that's what goes into a new drug application or NDA safety database. But you can imagine after this controlled setting is over, this post-marketing assessment of medicines is really important to really define the safety profile of an intervention in the real world and filling the evidence gap that wasn't filled by the pre-marketing studies. I should say, please stop at any moment if you want to have questions or further comment. So like I said, there are limitations to the pre-marketing clinical trials. The FDA does require a minimal safety database, which is not a hard and fast rule and depends on the indication being studied. But you can understand that the population that's being studied in those clinical trials is often more narrow than than how the drug will be used in the real world. And it's very controlled between the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the kind of intervention in itself of being in a clinical trial and having to show up at the clinic more frequently than usual. And then the follow-up is usually much shorter duration, particularly for medicines that are used in the chronic setting. So the benefits of post-marketing monitoring is that our ability is improved to study low frequency reactions. So like I said, in the clinical trial setting, the denominator just might not be big enough to pick up rare adverse events. We can segment by high risk groups. We can look at longer term effects. In the real world, you might uncover drug interactions or certain food interactions. And you might be able to uncover increased severity of known reactions. And again, you're looking at the effects in a real world setting. So what are the types of post-marketing surveillance? Well, for clinicians in particular, there's spontaneous or voluntary reporting of cases, and that is done through the national system called FDA MedWatch. And here, clinicians can fill out a pretty simple form to report potentially drug-related adverse events to the FDA. There's also sometimes people will notice what they think might be a safety signal, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and publish it in the literature before it gets to the FDA. So there's an element of literature surveillance as well. Often, either driven by the manufacturer or by the FDA, so voluntary or required, there are post-marketing studies done. And this might be done to proactively study a particular adverse event amongst other things. And these can be observational or randomized. And finally, there's active surveillance. So that there are active databases for certain that have been set up by the FDA and others for certain types of events. We use the term sentinel as an indicating event that might make us suspicious that there's a bigger safety signal going on. And topic with small molecules has been unpredictable liver toxicity, which might be very rare, but can result in devastating consequences, including death. And so that's what initiated the Drug-Induced Liver Inquiry Network. So an active surveillance of known potentially hepatotoxic drugs. So how do post-marketing reports get to the FDA? So again, in the real world, patients, consumers, healthcare professionals might notice a potential adverse event that could be related to a therapeutic intervention. So we talked about MedWatch. That's a voluntary reporting that goes straight to the FDA. and then into what we call FAERS, the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. So a large database held by the FDA. But this voluntary reporting only really accounts for about 5% of all reports to the FDA. Any reports that are made to the manufacturer or any data that the manufacturer uncovers that might indicate a drug-related adverse event is required to be reported to the FDA by that manufacturer. And this represents 95% of all reports. So from a sponsor's or manufacturer's perspective, there are large departments of safety and pharmacovigilance who across the globe are collecting adverse event reports, not just from the clinical trials, but also from voluntary reporting or active inquiry. But also it's the accountability of the manufacturer to do a continuous literature surveillance, looking for some of those case reports that might not be reported directly to them or to the FDA, to make sure they have their own understanding of the risk, benefit, and safety of their products. So there are required post-marketing safety reports, and this is under the Code of Federal Regulations, and you can see the rule right there. But safety reports must be submitted to the agency for serious or unexpected adverse events, both from the US, but also globally, if you're a global manufacturer. And these reports need to be submitted to the FDA within 15 days. And then domestic spontaneous adverse events that are serious and expected, non-serious and unexpected, non-serious and expected, need to be submitted quarterly. So our understanding of the safety of a drug in the real world is really exponential in the first 3 years or so after a drug is on the market. And then after that, I think most clinicians and the agency and the sponsor have some comfort that they understand the use and the benefit of the drugs. But that immediate post-marketing time is often when some of the rare adverse events that weren't detected in the clinical trials phase surface. So what is a serious adverse event? So it sounds very colloquial, but it has a regulatory definition. So a serious adverse event, or SAE as we call them, result in any of these outcomes, and that's what drives that mandatory reporting. So the spontaneous reports we discussed already are communications from an individual. It could be a healthcare professional, or it could be the patient himself or herself to the company or the regulatory authority. And remember that these spontaneous reports describe suspected drug-related adverse events. So we'll talk about the adjudication of these reports and how we attribute or not the adverse event to the actual therapeutic intervention. As you can imagine, though, spontaneous reporting is affected by a lot of external factors. How top of mind is it? Is there media attention? Have there been lawsuits that raise the level of awareness of this type of event? What is it, a drug that many people take or few people take? And is it a common or not so common indication? Like I mentioned, it's early on in the availability of a prescription medicine that gives it the attention from the public and from clinicians in terms of looking for drug-related adverse events. A larger global pharma company will have a quite sophisticated drug adverse event surveillance system, whereas your smaller biotechs might not. So that affects the amount of reporting and whether or not it's a prescription or over-the-counter product. So what is the FDA adverse event reporting system? It's a computerized database held by the FDA that contains spontaneous reports as well as manufacturers' reports, and is quite large with greater than 9 million reports since 1969. And you can imagine that now with sort of digital reporting, this database has grown, and we'll talk about how we might use a database like this for data mining to look for more trends or signals. So what are some strengths of this database? It includes all US marketed products across all uses. And while in clinical trials, you might have a very narrow patient population, let's say adult white males in the past, right? But this includes a much broader patient population including pregnant women and people with many comorbidities who are often excluded from the clinical trials. It's a good database for events that are rare. It's useful for events that occur shortly after exposure, so attribution is kind of easier to designate. It's great for signals that we don't see within the clinical trials, and the identification of reporting trends, possible risk factors, possible at-risk populations, and other clinically significant emerging safety concerns. What is PHAR's not good at? Describing events with high background rates, understanding if signals are due to worsening of pre-existing disease. The adverse events are linked to a name of the drug. So beyond that, it's hard to understand comparing drugs in the same class, comparative incidence rates across population, and adverse events that could also be manifestation of disease progression. And then there are reporting biases. How do reports get generated? What are the biases of the people that make those or the companies that make those? So we just talked about the reporting of adverse events, but that reporting collectively can lead to safety signal detection. Or in other words, is there something new that the adverse event reporting is telling us? So what is a safety signal? Well, it's reported information on a possible causal relationship between an adverse event and a drug. This relationship might previously have been unknown or incompletely documented. Maybe there was a slight trend during the clinical trials of drug-related adverse event that part of the population was experiencing, but because the sample size was much smaller, it wasn't well understood or well documented. This is where you have emerging safety signals in the post-marketing period that help expand the knowledge base and understanding of drug-related adverse event. Usually this is reported by multiple case, is supported by multiple case reports. So you're seeing single adverse events reported, but over a large, over time and a larger database, you're going to see a trend or a safety signal. The way the FDA communicates what a drug can and can't do and how effective it is or how safe it is through the label. Now, if you're like me, well, prior to being in industry, I never really read the label, but that's that little piece of paper that comes in your drug package. So sometimes out of the clinical trials, the adverse events that are known are included in the label. But often a safety signal in the post-marketing period can help surface new adverse events that have eventually become part of the label. Other safety signals include an increased incidence or greater severity that wasn't seen in the clinical trial period, or new interactions, or a newly identified at-risk population. That could be, for instance, renal toxicity in patients who already have renal insufficiency. There might not have been enough of those patients in the clinical trials to really understand that. So what are sources of possible safety signals? Routine pharmacovigilance, that includes the FDA safety database, data mining from that database and others, and the periodic safety update reports that are required from the drug manufacturer. Often there are signals within the clinical trials, both pre-marketing and post-marketing. There can be reports of safety signals within the literature. Perhaps there's something that emerges in the popular media. There's the new drug application safety database we already talked about, and the regulatory bodies across the globe do talk to each other. And sometimes you'll see a safety signal emerge in a country or region, perhaps where the drug is used more often or more commonly, or where in a country where the drug has been authorized longer, there might be safety signals coming from there and other sources. So we talked about adverse events and adverse events that result in an emerging safety signal. I thought we'd talk a little bit about what makes a good post-marketing report, because as this group knows, the data is those signals and what you can get from the data is only as good as the data that goes in. So if you are reporting a potential drug-related adverse event, a comprehensive description of the adverse event is important. All the details you can come up with in terms of the suspected product that might have precipitated that event and any other concomitant medications that could cloud the issue. Patient characteristics and baseline medical condition and comorbid conditions, other risk factors, those demographics are going to help people understand eventually, is there a particular patient subpopulation that's more at risk for a potential adverse event. Documentation of the diagnosis. Oftentimes, with an incomplete medical record, it's hard to know what to attribute any adverse event to. The clinical course and outcomes, any relevant therapeutic measures or laboratory data. We talked about hepatotoxicity, renal toxicity, those laboratory data and trends within that on an individual level are important to report. If there was a D challenge, so you withdrew the potential related medication and re-challenged, and what was the result, the clinical result of that would be super important information. And then your contact information in case the agency wants more information and any other relevant information. So what I'm trying to say in short is the more data, the more metadata you have around an adverse event included in the report, because it's hard to understand what's going to be important as if other similar adverse events are also reported.
So how does it work in the hospital for reporting medication related events? They get reported.
Is that Jody?
I'm asking Dr. Petty, who's here in the room. He's head of our PNT committee.
Oh, okay.
How the hospital does it.
So the hospital doesn't require reporting. It's
Yeah.
voluntary in the hospital as well. If there is a desire to use MedWatch system, for example, the pharmacy will be a resource to help the clinician make that report, or the clinician can do it independently. We pay lots of attention to safety data. I'm especially interested when it's compared to placebo of the same type of patient when that's available. And very often the databases from the sponsor will have that kind of information. That's really very useful.
Does the pharmacy do anything to encourage clinicians here to report?
I don't know that I know of a specific initiative where that's happened. I think many clinicians, if not most, are familiar with MedWatch, but I think they're feeling they're awfully busy, and you know they'll put things in the chart which could be extracted to either create a paper or publication of some sort, or you could mine that all out and send it to MedWatch if you really wanted to make a crusade of enriching the MedWatch data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's my experience both as a clinician and on the sponsor side that the voluntary reporting from actual clinicians is not terribly common. I think although people are familiar with MedWatch and that you can report, I don't think it's very top of mind. Would that be consistent with your experience in the hospital and in the clinic?
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, I think the other thing is, especially when the studies are supported by industry, the assumption is, well, the sponsor will take care of the reporting at the FDA. That's their obligation as being the sponsor, the manufacturer. And so I, as a clinician, don't need to worry about that. Outside of clinical trials, you know, we remind people about MedWatch. We mention it in our newsletter frequently. And yet, I agree with you, it's not top of mind. What's top of mind is getting these people better and out of the hospital.
That's right. And I think we'll talk about this toward the end of our time, but I think there's the potential for AI and machine learning to mine the medical record for potential drug-related adverse events. Because like you said, people chart it and report it in the medical record, but not necessarily directly to the FDA or the sponsor. So there might be potential to enhance the data we're getting out of the real world clinical setting through some of those means.
If I can reject there, I think that's an interesting concept, but it strikes me that that would be very difficult for attribution, although it could be the program, so it was the most recent added medication that is the highest likelihood of being the offender. But,
Yeah, I would agree. It's messy. It'd be super messy data that would be hard to interpret. And so we probably have to advance a little in where we are with AI in particular. And then there's a whole host of privacy issues that come up with that as well. Okay, so continuing on, what are some principles of case evaluation? So now you have a report that is a suspected adverse event related to a drug therapy. How do you understand that attribution? Can you attribute this adverse event to the particular drug intervention? Well, there's a whole system in place that looks at that. Obviously, temporal relationship between the dose and the adverse event is important. There's a system by which the regulators submit and receive information from the World Health Organization, Uppsala Monitoring Center, where there's a whole classification scheme of attributability of an adverse event or safety signal to the actual intervention. And there are certain criteria that go with that. But key factors in causality assessment include the de-challenge, re-challenge situation we just talked about, comorbidities, concomitant medications, and if there's biologic plausibility that this is a known on-target effect or a known effect of a particular portion of the intervention. You can think of antibody therapy and their immunogenicity as being something that makes biologic sense. Sometimes there are chemical moieties on a small molecule that are known to cause certain toxicities, like QT prolongation, for instance. So after you get a report of an AE and you have a potential signal and you've determined at causality, plausibility, then you can develop a case series to look at, start with your well-documented case in the adverse event reporting system, published literature, etc., and then use that knowledge of the clinical course of the disease to formulate a case definition that might include both clinical features and laboratory findings, or even demographic information that defines an at-risk specific population. Then complete a thorough database search for additional cases. And when you have that case series, that's really the body of data that can make you feel more certain you have a significant adverse event that's drug related. So what do we do with this information? If you're the sponsor, right, you can take it on yourself to propose a label change, a warning, precaution. We've all heard about black box warnings, to craft that risk benefit profile, which you will share with the agency. Ultimately, the FDA exercises authority on what that product information or labeling change should look like in light of this new safety data. In addition to the label, there are also continued pharmacovigilance activities. Pharmacovigilance is a real-time activity where you're proactively getting data, analyzing it, and then making the appropriate changes to your surveillance activities. Sometimes registries are warranted, like think of pregnancy registries with some of our drugs, or epidemiologic studies to look at larger swaths of potentially affected patients on the identified drug. There is a regulatory action where the FDA can require the sponsor to put together a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. You can think of uses of thalidomide and all the paperwork that goes with that that's part of a REMS program that's required in order to use the drug. There are the drug safety communications. Those are the letters issued by the company alerting clinicians and prescribers to a potential or documented safety signal. And the most dramatic action that the FDA can take is a mandatory withdrawal from the market. You can think of the COX-2 inhibitors were initially pulled for increased cardiac risk, but then reintroduced for certain patient populations. So those are the kind of regulatory actions that can occur. I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. I have just a few more topics on kind of newer trends in pharmacovigilance. But before I move to that, I'll see if there are any questions or comments from the room.
Go ahead. Yep. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
In case of market withdrawal is ordered by the FDA, and if the product is also exported to some other jurisdiction, so is there any obligation on the FDA to report to the FDA of the respective jurisdiction? Let us say the product gets exported to Brazil. So does the FDA report to the FDA of Brazil in that case?
I think that's when the WHO Uppsala Monitoring Center comes into play. That's a bi-directional flow of information between the regional or country-specific regulatory authorities and the WHO. And so that information will get distributed to the other any other regions or countries where a particular product is marketed. I think, you know, the many of your more developing countries or middle income countries who don't have a well-developed or sophisticated regulatory authority in place will often follow the FDA's lead. The European Medicine Agency and the Japanese Medicines Agency tend to be a little more independent, but there's a lot of collaboration between, particularly in the post-marketing arena, between the agencies and through the WHO.
Thank you.
Are there minimum criteria before the drug is withdrawn from the market? That's the number of serious adverse events or other reports.
Did you hear that?
Would you mind repeating?
Sure. Is there a minimum requirement in terms of like number of adverse events or number of serious adverse events before a product is withdrawn from the market?
Not to my knowledge. The types of things that have historically resulted in market withdrawal are, you know, idiosyncratic, unpredictable, life-threatening, serious adverse events. You can think of, there was an antibiotic called trovafloxacin that was on the market for a very short period of time because of idiosyncratic hepatotoxicity that resulted in liver failure and death. So that is very few reports, but a very devastating outcome. I think in other situations, there might be significant reports of serious adverse events. You can think of conventional chemotherapy for oncology, but the risk benefit for the patient warrants continued use of the product. So there are no hard and fast rules about numbers. It's really a case by case evaluation by the agency and the sponsor.
Thank you. Go ahead.
You had mentioned that around like 95% of the reports are by manufacturers and only 5% are by healthcare professionals. So I was curious about like the source of data that manufacturers get it from. Do they have like any surveillance systems in it? And if there a minimum period in which they're supposed to maintain it?
Could you repeat, please?
Sure. So you had a slide that showed that 95% of these events are reported by the manufacturer, and he's asking if there are specific ways they get their data, is that correct?
Yeah, if they have any surveillance.
Yeah, so
Systems.
depending on it, so let's take the example of immediately post authorization. So when a drug is first available, widely available on the market, there is active outreach by the company to prescribers in some situations. There's literature surveillance. So our surveying those things like media outlets as well as scientific literature. And then there's, an encouragement of reporting. So it's a very active surveillance. And I think most of the data and the reports come to the manufacturers first through those active and passive mechanisms, as opposed to from the clinicians through MedWatch. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so I was like right after the drug approval, let's say like a period of 2 or 3 years, the system is in place and it's supposed to die down. So wouldn't that compromise the integrity of the whole database? Because if we take like 5 years down the line, if the active reporting is not being taking place, so a whole disproportionate reporting would take place, and wouldn't that compromise with the integrity of the signal?
If I heard that, well, maybe someone in the room could repeat.
I think you're asking if the reporting is only occurring during the first 3 years, is that compromising the integrity of data by stopping at 3 years versus continuing on? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I think it's thought that most of these yet unreported safety signals will emerge during the first 3 years. There's still, and that's why the onus is on the sponsor to report quarterly to the FDA. But after those first 3 years, the sponsor will report annually, I think, for perpetuity. So it becomes a significant and then during that time, the clinical sort of comfort or understanding of the use of the product also emerges. And so unless you expect significant long-term safety signals beyond 3-5 years, it is a bias in the database, but one I think people accept for most therapies.
Could you please shed some light on adverse event reporting for off-label use of drugs, and if the owner does follow the drug company to, of course, report it, but also need to make changes to their label, etc. for off-label use?
She's asking about, did you hear that adverse event reporting for off-label uses of drugs?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one, right? But that is covered by the FDA adverse reporting system. Because as we all know, there's the labeled indication and then there's off-label use. But that off-label use gets reported to both sponsors and directly to the FDA, whether or not it's an approved indication. So you're not limited, even as the sponsor, to collecting. You shouldn't be limited to collecting adverse events only related to the indicated condition, because all use enhances and expands the safety database.
And can those, she also asked if those adverse events can lead to a label change?
Yes, although I don't take my word for that. I believe so, because once a safety issue is known, it'll be reported in the way it was used. That might go into the label in a very specific way, depending on how related that condition is to the indicated condition. Those are the sorts of things that might result in the FDA asking or requiring a sponsor to do a post-marketing or a phase 4 study, not for approval in an indication, but to understand the safety better as a result of receiving that data.
Thank you.
So I think the sponsors are required to submit the safety studies to the FDA. But by law, are they required to publish the studies or put results in public domain?
No, they're not required to publish like in a journal, but they are required to post that safety study on clinicaltrials.gov. So in that way, it's in the public domain, but it might not be written up in the way a phase 3 trial might be, particularly if it's favorable.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
So you mentioned the Uppsala Monitoring Center. Do they have a role in the regulatory actions, or is it just for a database of adverse events?
Could you repeat, please?
Yeah, she asked if the Uppsala Monitoring Center has any role in the regulatory changes and actions, or do they just maintain a database?
They maintain and distribute data, right, and analyses but they're not a regulatory authority, so they can't. There's no legal remit globally for them to demand label changes or market withdrawal. That's left to the regulatory authorities in country or in region.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, I think we're all set if you want to continue.
Okay, well, I know we're, so Jill, a little guidance. I just have a couple more slides that might be interesting for trends. But I recognize that we're close to time here. What's your guidance?
You can feel free to go through them, and if people need to leave.
Okay, no problem then. So I thought I'd move just to sort of emerging trends in pharmacovigilance, because it can seem a little dry, although I'm glad there was interest in questions from the room. We touched on this a little bit with database networks for post-marketing surveillance. There's increased access to large-scale distributed database networks, and there's an opportunity here to monitor post-marketing safety and generate real-world evidence from mining these databases to support decision-making. An example, we talked about the Sentinel initiative briefly as a database that's surveilled for safety. So a Sentinel event is sort of your first subject that's reported with a potential liver toxicity that's drug related. So you want to act on that Sentinel case for this within the use of that particular product, but also the data from that Sentinel case might help you identify other patients that might be at risk. So this is an infrastructure analyzing electronic healthcare data to assess safety of approved medicinal products. And now it was established by the FDA in 2008, and now is one of the largest distributed database networks. And it comprised, oh, I'm sorry, I have the typos. The Sentinel system, which uses common data models and analytic tools and pre-existing real-world data, and FDA Catalyst that is pushes out routine queries and interventions and interactions with health plan members or providers. So this database has been useful for discovering, mining, understanding where those safety signals might emerge. We talked a little bit about AI. Again, huge amounts of accessible electronic data. Can we use AI to improve safety assessment by information extraction using natural language processing techniques, text mining to gather relevant insights from unstructured sources? So we talked a little bit about the medical record, but this, if we get it right, this sort of data mining might be useful to uncover, with less sort of human bias, if you like, more information on potential adverse drug reactions, drug-drug interactions from a variety of sources. It also, we talked a lot about the routine sort of work of pharmacovigilance, but it might be that with AI, we're able to effectively use those reports more efficiently with automatic execution of tasks, identifying clusters of adverse events, with common symptomology, conduction of pharmacoepidemiologic studies. You can reach a lot more people and choose the right people to reach, perhaps with artificial intelligence. That data linkage and matching within data sets might surface insights about who's at risk and whether demographic or disease subset. And can we use AI to predict and prevent adverse events through modeling of real world data? These are some of the sort of more exciting things that our AI might deliver in pharmacovigilance. Digital therapeutics are becoming more prevalent. You can think of web-based cognitive behavioral therapy programs, game-based interventions, or even medical adherence or personalized coaching therapeutics. Like you can think of like Noom as a behavioral intervention that's digital. But these therapies are hard. We're less familiar with them, as you can probably tell. Our safety surveillance system is really set up for drugs, conventional prescription drugs, and so digital therapeutics, they're newer. It's less clear how to monitor safety, the side effects that might be associated with digital therapeutics might be less severe and therefore less reported, and they might not generate the attention that conventional drugs might. And then, but it is suggested from the pre-marketing clinical trials that there might be adverse events that occur for the digital therapy to a greater extent than in the control placebo arm. So figuring out how to do safety monitoring with digital therapies over time is going to be important. Another aspect of digital therapy is they're often collecting data. So that can be quite powerful to reassess safety and effectiveness in the real world setting. You can think of some of the games as therapy for ADHD. Like, what are they collecting, and are we really understanding the safety, screen time, versus the efficacy? How much is behavior improving over time? I think the downside is there's an increase of patient-related health data that poses concerns about how we're ensuring that privacy is respected and what's the quality of that data. So I think this suggests that we need a legal and regulatory framework that guarantees privacy, but allows for sharing of this data for research purposes, which could be very powerful. There are advanced therapy medicinal products. That's a mouthful, but that's a term from the European Medicine Agency, and includes gene therapy, cell-based therapy, tissue engineering, etc. It's an interesting area from a pharmacovigilance perspective, because these medicines often address unmet medical needs, serious conditions, or rare diseases. So they often qualify for accelerated assessment by the regulators and approval. So that means sometimes that they're approved on a much smaller database. Think of rare diseases than your typical drug or therapeutic. So in these cases, post-marketing studies are going to play a significant role in understanding the long-term safety, because many of these advanced therapy medicinal products are quite innovative, but come with significant safety risk. So that safety surveillance needs to start really early in the clinical development setting, but continue throughout the development and post-marketing arena. You can think of things like gene therapy that might be a one and done therapy, right? But then how do we understand, when you've manipulated a gene way back when, that it's safe? What's the safety look like over a long period of time? There are therapies like CAR-Ts, which require routine risk management and minimization measures, but can need to be supplemented with additional risk monitoring, given the severity of the potential adverse events like cytokine release syndrome, infections, and serious CNS type adverse reactions. And finally, we have a new term, eco-pharmacovigilance. What is that even? Eco-pharmacovigilance studies the effect of the presence of pharmaceuticals in the environment and requires detection, assessment, and understanding and a prevention of adverse effects or other problems that might affect both humans and other wildlife. And the notion of ecopharmacovigilance is to really understand what the environmental risk of pharmaceutical pollutants are or will be. And these pharmaceutical pollutants are excreted into the environment. It could be by the patient as a parent compound or active metabolites that gets excreted in urine or feces, ends up in the sewer system, in wastewater, in landfills. It's not an FDA responsibility per se, but it does, it is an area of growing concern as there's more and more pharmaceuticals present in our environment. You may notice at your CVS or your Walgreens, they have boxes for you to dispose of your medicines safely, so you don't flush them or put them in a landfill. So this is the kind of pharmacovigilance from an ecosystem standpoint we're looking at. I ran over that very quickly, but I just wanted to give a little color to where safety and pharmacovigilance might be going with new technologies, new awareness, new therapies, AI, digital, all those things. So I hope that was interesting, and that's all I have for you. So I'll stop there and take any further questions or comments.
Thank you so much. We could probably do about 5 minutes of questions if anyone has anything after this last few slides. And if not, if you're a trainee and you want to meet with Judi after this, she has graciously agreed, and I've sent some Zoom links to some people, but if you don't have it and you would like to join, just shoot me an email. And I'll send it to you. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Well, great. Thanks for the invitation and for the engagement. And I'll look forward to speaking to anybody who's interested in further discussion in a few minutes.
Okay, we'll see you on that link in a few. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.